I built a fortress in a place most people don't notice until something goes wrong. A rail yard that smelled like creosote, old diesel, wet ballast, and hot brake shoes. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the soft ticking of cooling metal after a locomotive shuts down and the distant clang of a coupler knuckle when a cut of cars gets shoved together. My name is Evan Rourke. Before everything broke, I was a mechanical technician for a freight railroad contractor in the Midwest. Not a romantic job, not a movie job. I was the guy who crawled under things to find leaks, who carried a torque wrench and a multimeter, who knew the difference between a bad bearing and a bad idea. I also had an unusual advantage. I knew how to keep trains moving, and, more importantly, how to keep them safe when you needed them to stop. When the outbreak started, most people ran toward what they thought would protect them. Crowded buildings, big parking lots, stadiums, places that looked solid. I'd spent enough nights in yards during storms to know that solid is a trick word. A structure is only safe if you can control access, power, water, and information. A rail yard has all four if you know where to look. It also has something else. Distance. Real distance. Measured in miles of steel ribbon that most people can't navigate on foot without getting tired, hurt, or lost. I didn't set out to build a train fortress. I set out to survive the first night. The first reports came through the radio in the service truck. I was on a late call near the Belt Railway area outside Chicago, not far from some of the intermodal facilities. A crew had reported a hotbox detector alarm earlier, and the supervisor wanted a confirmation before they released the train. That's how it worked. A wayside detector says a bearing is hot. Someone has to check it, and everyone pretends it's routine because routine keeps people calm. That night, routine cracked. Police scanners were already noisy. I'd kept a little handheld in the truck because rail work teaches you that you don't want surprises. There was a call about a fight on a commuter platform, then another about someone biting. The dispatcher's voice kept trying to turn it into a simple assault, like the right words could fix it. Then the calls multiplied. Stabbings, but not stabbings. People acting strange. People not responding. The phrases repeated like a stuck wheel. Not responding. Not responding. The rail crew I was meeting, engineer named Cal and conductor named Denise, were standing on ballast near the train with their lanterns and reflective vests, both of them looking down at their phones like the screens could tell them what to do. Cal's locomotive was idling, the low rumble steady as a heartbeat. That sound did more for me than any motivational speech ever could. A locomotive doesn't care about panic. It cares about air pressure, fuel, and traction. Denise looked up when she saw me, her eyes wide in the LED glare. "You hearing this?" "I'm hearing it," I said. "Let's do the bearing, then I'm not staying." We did the check fast. I used an infrared thermometer on the journal area, checked for any grease sling, listened for the grind that tells you the bearing is on borrowed time. It wasn't. The detector had been wrong, or the reading had cooled by the time the train reached the next point. That happens. Then Cal's radio crackled with a yardmaster message that wasn't about trains. It was a warning, something like, "Stay put, do not go into public, report any disturbances." It was the first time I'd ever heard a railroad official use a tone like that, like he was talking to family. Denise swallowed hard. "My sister's downtown." Cal stared at his locomotive like it might give him instructions. "They'll shut the city. They always do. But I knew what the scanner was saying underneath the words. Whatever this was, it wasn't contained. And it wasn't behaving like a normal incident. The calls weren't slowing down. They were spreading outward in a pattern that looked like one thing: movement. I got back into my service truck and turned the key without thinking. Then I stopped with my hand on the wheel, because I realized something that made my throat go dry. Roads would become traps. I'd seen it in winter storms, in pileups, in floods. People abandon cars. Then cars become barriers. Then barriers become walls, and walls become a gridlock that nobody can solve. Rails don't gridlock the same way. Rails are controlled by signals and dispatch. If signals go dark, trains stop, by design. And if trains stop, you can still move them if you know how, because steel wheels on steel rails don't need perfect roads. They need a path. I looked at Cal and Denise. "How far are you headed?" Cal blinked. "West. Out toward Iowa. We're hauling mixed freight. Got hazmat placards in the consist, but nothing crazy." Hazmat placards. I didn't like the sound of that, but it also meant the train would be taken seriously, handled carefully, protected by procedure. It meant it had resources: air systems, generators, and a locomotive with a fuel tank that could outlast a lot of people's plans. "I want on," I said. Denise frowned. "You're not crew." "I can keep your locomotive alive if you have trouble," I said, "and I can get you through a dead yard if the signals go down." Cal and Denise exchanged a look. In a normal world, they would have laughed and told me to call management. In that moment, normal had already left. Cal nodded slowly. "Climb up. We're leaving." I grabbed my bag from the truck: basic tools, spare gloves, a headlamp, a small first aid pouch, water bottle. I left the truck where it sat, keys in it, because I knew I wouldn't come back. That's the moment the train stopped being a job and started being a lifeboat. For the first hour, the world still pretended it was intact. Dispatch talked to trains. Signals worked. The grade crossings flashed and the gates came down like always. We rolled past lines of cars that weren't moving. People leaning out windows, phones held high, faces lit by screens. You could see confusion more than fear. Then the calls started coming over the railroad radio. Reports of people on tracks, people on the right-of-way, people near crossings. Trains were being told to slow, to stop, to hold. The dispatcher's voice was tight. His words were careful, like he was walking on glass. We got a stop signal near a junction. Cal brought the train down smoothly, air brakes hissing, slack running in a long shudder that you can feel in your teeth. When we stopped, the quiet was wrong. Not quiet like peace. Quiet like a machine that has paused in the middle of an important cycle. Denise watched the road crossing ahead through binoculars. "There's a crowd." I leaned forward. In the beam of the locomotive lights, you could see figures moving near the gates. Not cars, people. Some waving, some stumbling, some just standing there like they didn't understand the idea of distance. Cal keyed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Freight 108. We're at the stop. We've got people fouling the crossing." The dispatcher answered a moment later. "Freight 108, hold, authorities notified, do not proceed until clear." Authorities. That word sounded heavy and fragile at the same time. Denise lowered the binoculars. "They're not waving like normal." I didn't want to say what my brain was already building. I'd heard enough on the scanner, enough of the same pattern. Cal glanced at me. "If the signal stays red and the crossing stays blocked, What happens? Eventually, I said, you're a parked train with a line of cars behind you and a crowd in front. Denise's jaw tightened. We can't sit here. Cal looked down at his controls. We can't run a stop signal. We do that, we're off the books. We're on our own. The phrase landed like a door closing. Then, in the distance, we heard something I'll never forget. Not sirens, not gunshots, not the chaos you expect from disaster. It was a long, rising sound, like a wave of shouting that couldn't decide whether it was anger or panic. It rolled through the night and hit us in the cab like pressure. Denise whispered, "That's the city." Cal didn't answer. He just stared at the red signal like it was a judge. I made the decision before I realized I was making it. Cal, if you don't move now, you might not move at all. He exhaled hard. I know. Denise's voice was sharp. If we go through, we're committed. Cal's fingers curled around the throttle. I'm committed. He released the independent brake, eased the throttle, and the locomotive began to pull. The steel under us responded with a low groan that turned into steady motion. We were moving through a red signal, slowly, deliberately, like we were stepping off a cliff and hoping there was ground. The people at the crossing noticed the headlights and turned. Some started waving harder. Some stepped toward the track like they could bargain with a train. Cal leaned on the horn. Long, loud blasts that normally clear a crossing. The sound echoed off warehouses and empty lots. It didn't clear them. Denise swore under her breath. Cal didn't speed up. He couldn't. A freight train doesn't sprint. It commits. At the last moment, a few of the figures moved aside. Others didn't. I saw shapes in the beam that were wrong. Posture too stiff. Movements too late. Heads snapping toward sound like a predator animal hearing a twig. Cal kept the train steady, and the crossing disappeared under us. I didn't look down. I didn't want my mind to have that picture. I kept my eyes forward and focused on the one thing that mattered. Rails ahead. Once we cleared the crossing, Cal brought the speed up. The train's rhythm changed, the wheels singing on joint bars, the cab vibrating in a familiar way that should have been comforting. But nothing was comforting anymore. We ran for hours into the dark, following dispatch instructions until dispatch stopped answering. It wasn't dramatic at first. A missed call, a delayed response, then a message that cut off mid-sentence, then silence. Trains ahead of us began broadcasting position reports on the common channel, like they were trying to recreate order with their own voices. Some were calm. Some sounded like they were holding back tears. One engineer in a trembling voice said he'd hit people on the track and didn't know what to do. Denise turned the radio volume down. I can't. Cal drove with his jaw clenched, eyes scanning the dark. We keep going until we can't. I watched the gauges like they were living things. Main reservoir pressure, brake pipe pressure, fuel level, amperage. The locomotive didn't care about cities falling. It cared about physics and maintenance. That was when I understood the shape of my future. If I could keep this machine alive, I could keep myself alive. A train is a moving platform with fuel, shelter, and the ability to leave problems behind. But it was also a long, heavy, hard-to-turn commitment. You don't just take a train somewhere. You don't just hide. You don't just stop and start like a car. Every move is a plan, and every plan has consequences. Sometime near dawn, We stopped on a siding outside a small town that looked asleep from a distance. The sky was gray and low. The ground was wet. The trees were bare. Cal set the brakes and killed the throttle. The locomotive idled. Denise sat back exhausted, hands shaking. Cal spoke softly. "We need to check in with somebody. Anybody. Management. Police. Someone." Denise didn't laugh, but her mouth twisted like she wanted to. "With what phones? With what towers?" I pulled out my own phone. No service. I tried again. Still nothing. A dead rectangle. "We can use the locomotive radio," Cal said, like he was trying to convince himself. "Railroads have their own repeaters, their own networks." He keyed the mic and called. No answer. He tried another channel. Another. Nothing but static. The world had gone quiet in a way that felt impossible. Denise stared out the window at the empty town. "We're alone." "No," I said, and my voice surprised me with how steady it was. "We're not alone. We're just not connected." Cal looked at me. "What do you mean?" I pointed down the length of the train behind us. "We have a moving building. It's got steel walls, it's got air systems, it's got power if we can keep the locomotive running. It's got storage space and tools and parts." Denise's eyes narrowed. "You're talking like we're going to live on this thing." I didn't want to say yes, because yes meant accepting that whatever was happening wasn't temporary. But I also didn't want to lie. "I'm talking like roads are going to be worse than rails," I said, "and like buildings are going to be crowded, and like if we get off this train without a plan, we might not get back on." Cal rubbed his face with one hand. "We can't haul a whole life." "Not yet," I said, "but we can build one." That's the first time I used the word build. It was the seed of the idea. The next decision came from necessity. We needed water, food, and a way to see what the world looked like. We needed to know if the town was empty, safe, or already wrong. Denise insisted on going with Cal for the first scouting run. She'd been a conductor for 10 years. She knew how to move around equipment safely, how to watch for dangers people don't think about. Slippery steps, pinch points, swinging couplers. She also didn't trust me yet. Not fully, and I didn't blame her. Before they climbed down, I went through the locomotive's basic supplies: fire extinguisher, emergency kit, spare fuses, flares. I found a high-visibility vest and a hard hat in a cabinet and handed them to Cal. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but he put it on. I didn't hand them a weapon because we didn't have one. Rail workers aren't armed. The most dangerous thing we had was a pry bar and a heavy wrench. Cal and Denise climbed down and walked along the ballast toward the road. I watched through the window until they disappeared behind a stand of trees. That wait changed me. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because I realized I was guarding a train like it was a home. The locomotive cab was suddenly a control room. The rails outside were suddenly a boundary. The silence was suddenly a threat. When Cal and Denise returned, their faces told me the story before they spoke. "There are people," Denise said, breathless, "in the town. Not a lot, but enough." Cal nodded grimly. "They're moving wrong. They don't respond to shouting. They notice sound, though. We threw a rock and they all turned." My stomach tightened. "Any stores?" "A gas station with a small convenience section," Cal said. "Locked. We didn't try to break in, but there's a water tower behind it. We saw a spigot for maintenance. Could be live." "Could," Denise emphasized. "Or could be dry." "And cars?" I asked. Denise shrugged. some abandoned, some with doors open, like people ran. Cal looked at the train. We can't just walk around like this, not without something. I nodded. I know. That day became our first lesson. The world outside the rails was unpredictable, full of movement that didn't follow rules. The train, for all its complexity, was at least predictable. It did what physics told it to do. We spent the next 2 days doing careful trips into the edge of town for supplies. We moved like technicians, not heroes. We kept distance. We didn't try to clear anything. We took what we could carry and returned to the train fast. We found bottled water first, then canned food, then a camping stove someone had left behind in the back of a pickup truck, still in its box like the owner had bought it and never used it. We scavenged batteries, lighters, duct tape, gloves, tarps. We found a small hand-crank radio in a sporting goods aisle, and it became our lifeline, though it mostly hissed at us with static. The first time we saw someone who was still themselves, it didn't feel like hope. It felt like danger. She was standing near the edge of the road, waving both hands like a person trying to flag down a ride. She looked exhausted, her clothes dirty, hair tied back. She called out when she saw us. "Hey, hey, please!" Denise froze. Cal started to step forward. I grabbed Cal's sleeve. "Stop, don't get close." The woman's eyes flicked to the train behind us. "Is that yours?" "Please, I need help. I haven't eaten. I'm not sick. I'm not like them." That phrase made my skin prickle. Not like them. Denise swallowed. "What's your name?" "Marisol," she said quickly. "Marisol Vega. I was a paramedic. I was working nights. We tried to help, and it didn't work." A paramedic. The words carried weight. Someone who knew medical reality. Someone whose instincts might be useful. Cal looked at me, questioning. I kept my voice calm. "Marisol, stay where you are. Tell us what you've seen from there." She nodded hard, almost crying. It started with people collapsing and then getting back up, but not right. They were fast at first, like panic. Then they got slower, but they don't stop. They don't get tired. They follow noise. They gather. They don't talk. She took a shaky breath. The hospitals got overwhelmed. Then the staff started disappearing. Then the doors got locked. Then the ambulances stopped coming back. Denise's eyes were wet. "Where are you from?" "Cicero," Marisol said. "My mom's there. I tried to get back, but the roads are blocked. I followed tracks because there were fewer cars." That made sense. People would eventually discover what I'd discovered. Rails are paths. I looked at her hands. No obvious injuries. No obvious signs of anything. But there was no test we could run. No guaranteed safety. "Do you have any weapons?" I asked. Marisol shook her head. "No, I had a bag, but I lost it." Cal whispered. "We can't leave her." Denise whispered back. "We can't just bring everyone." I stared at the train in the distance. Steel walls, a finite space, a finite amount of food, but also a chance to add skills. "Marisol," I called. "We can bring you with us, but you follow rules, strict rules." She nodded frantically. "Anything. Anything." "First rule," I said, "you don't come within arm's reach of us until we've watched you for a while. You stay in a separate space. You don't touch our food or water until we decide." Her face tightened, but she nodded again. "Okay." "Second rule," I said. "If you feel sick, confused, or not yourself, you tell us immediately. No hiding." "I will," she said. "Third rule," I said. "No shouting unless it's life or death. Sound brings them." Marisol glanced over her shoulder like she could already hear it. I know. Cal and Denise looked at me, and in their faces I saw the same thing I felt. We were making a community out of a machine, one decision at a time. We escorted Marisol back to the train, keeping distance, watching every movement. When she climbed up, I guided her into the second locomotive unit. Cal's train had 2 locomotives for power, and we set it up as a quarantine space. Not because we had official guidance, but because we needed a system that made sense. That night, we sat in the lead cab and ate canned food cold because we didn't want to light the stove and draw attention. The locomotive idled quietly, its vibration a constant reminder that we were sitting on something that could move. Marisol told us more, piece by piece, about what she'd seen. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't decorate it. She spoke like someone making a report, and that professionalism steadied us. Their hearing is good, she said. They react to loud, sharp noises faster than low, constant noises. A generator hum didn't draw them as much as a door slam. Cal rubbed his chin. A locomotive is a constant noise. Marisol nodded. Yes, but horns, gunshots, breaking glass, those were magnets. Denise asked, how do they spread it? Marisol hesitated. I don't know exactly. We suspected saliva, blood contact, open wounds. We never got a clear answer. We were too busy. I heard the stress under her calm voice, like a wire stretched too tight. That was the night the idea of the train fortress became more than an idea. It became a plan. We started with what we had, a freight train with mixed cars, some box cars, some covered hoppers. A few tank cars we decided to keep sealed and untouched because we didn't want to gamble with unknowns. We had locomotives, and locomotives meant electricity if we could manage it. Diesel-electric locomotives produce electric power through traction alternators and auxiliary systems. They also often have a hotel load system that can power onboard needs. It's not like plugging into a wall at home, but it's power. Lights, charging, sometimes even heating with the right setup. The trick is fuel, maintenance, and not running the engine non-stop without rest. I explained it to Cal and Denise like I was explaining to a new hire. We can't idle forever. Idling burns fuel and still wears the engine, but we can run in intervals. Keep batteries charged. Keep air pressure up. We can use the locomotive's air compressor to keep brake systems healthy, and we can siphon limited power for lighting and charging. Denise raised an eyebrow. Siphon. Not literally, I said. We'll stay within what the locomotive can provide safely, but we can wire a small inverter, use proper fusing, keep everything controlled. Cal exhaled. We're turning a locomotive into a generator. Locomotives already are, I said. We're just using it like one. Marisol listened, and then said something that shifted the plan from survive to build. People will follow the tracks, she said. Eventually, they'll find you. The sick ones and the healthy ones. Denise's shoulders tensed. So we keep moving. Yes, Marisol said, but you can't move forever without resupply. I nodded. So we create a loop, a route we can run to resupply safely. Cal looked at me. Safely. Safer, I corrected. We chose the route based on rail reality, not fantasy. You can't just take a train anywhere. You need active track, intact switches, and a path that won't dead end in a blocked crossing or a collapsed bridge. We didn't have dispatch support anymore. That meant we had to rely on manual methods and caution. I knew enough to know what we couldn't do. We couldn't run at speed through unknown territory. We couldn't assume crossings were clear. We couldn't assume bridges were intact. We couldn't assume someone hadn't moved a switch. A wrong switch alignment could send us into a siding or derail us. A derailment would end everything. So we moved slowly and used the train itself as a tool. Denise and Cal taught me the practical side of train handling, how slack behaves, how long it takes to stop, how you feel a change in grade. I taught them mechanical and electrical tricks, how to listen for air leaks, how to check traction motor blowers, how to keep the cooling system from overheating during long idles. We found our first true haven by accident, a maintenance of way spur near a rural area with a small ballast pit and an old crew building. It wasn't a fortress by itself. It was a place with a fence, a gate, and some stored material. But it had something we needed: water. There was a standpipe near the building for equipment use. When I turned the valve and water flowed, I almost laughed. It was cold and tasted metallic, but it was water. We filled every container we had, then started thinking like we weren't just passing through. "Here," Denise said, looking around, "we can work." We began upgrading the train like it was a ship. First, we secured the locomotives. Cab doors can be locked, but windows are weak. We used plywood from a storage area and cut panels to reinforce vulnerable points, leaving narrow sight slits. We didn't seal ourselves in completely, we needed visibility, but we reduced easy access. Second, we addressed the big problem. Freight cars are not living spaces. They're metal boxes that get hot and cold, and they're not meant for people. We chose a boxcar near the front of the consist and converted it into a living module. We swept out old debris, laid down pallets, then layered cardboard, foam, and tarps for insulation. It wasn't pretty. It was survival. Marisol became the organizer. She made a list like she was running a small clinic. "Sleeping," she said, "needs to be separate from cooking. Waste needs to be handled. Water needs to be protected." Denise, who had always been a rules person, nodded like she'd found something to hold on to. "We need a schedule." Cal surprised me by agreeing immediately. "We need a watch." I built a simple system for lighting that wouldn't scream our presence into the night. We scavenged LED work lights and ran them off batteries charged from the locomotive in controlled intervals. We avoided bright exterior lighting. Light can draw attention just like noise. We also built a quiet kit. That sounds small, but it mattered. We wrapped tools in cloth, padded door latches, added rubber to areas that clanged. The train is a metal world, and metal announces everything. If we wanted to survive, we had to become quiet in a place designed to be loud. The first time we truly tested our fortress wasn't in a dramatic battle. It was in patience. We were stopped on a siding near a grain elevator town in Illinois, resupplying from a small store set back from the tracks. We'd learned to scout first. Denise and I went out while Cal and Marisol stayed with the train. Denise carried a long pry bar. I carried a wrench, more for confidence than anything else. We moved carefully, staying off main streets, listening. We were inside the store when we heard the first crash outside. Not a scream, but a sudden smash like a door hit a wall. Denise froze. I killed my headlamp, and we stood in darkness, listening. Another crash, then a long scraping sound, then something that made my mouth go dry. A low, repetitive thump, like many feet. Not running, but gathering. Denise leaned close, whispering, "We're late. We took too long." I nodded once. We grabbed what we could quickly, water, canned food, a bag of rice, a box of batteries, and slipped out the back. We didn't sprint. Sprinting makes noise, makes mistakes. We moved fast but controlled, sticking to shadows. As we approached the tracks, we saw them. A cluster of figures near the crossing. More than before, dozens. Some standing still, heads cocked, listening. Some wandering aimlessly until a sound pulled them. They weren't coordinated like an army. They were a tide of attention, and attention is enough. The train sat on the siding like a dark wall. Cal was in the cab. Marisol was somewhere behind the locomotive, likely watching from a slit. Denise and I moved along the ditch line and climbed up the ballast. One figure turned toward us, head snapping like it had heard our breathing. It started moving, not sprinting, but fast enough to make your body want to panic. Denise whispered, "No noise." We climbed onto the train's ladder and pulled ourselves up. The coupler area creaked, and I wanted to swear, but we made it onto the deck and slipped into the living car. Inside, Cal's voice came through the radio handset we'd rigged between cars. "You okay?" "We're in," Denise said. "They're coming." Cal didn't ask for details. He did the one thing that mattered. He started the move. A train starting from rest is a slow miracle. Air pressure, throttle, traction. The slack takes up, the couplers clank as force moves down the line. If you slam it, you can break things. If you baby it too much, you don't move fast enough. Cal did it right. The train began to roll. Outside, I heard the first impacts as some of them pressed against the side of a car, hands scraping metal, shoes sliding in ballast. It was a sound I'll never forget because it was so ordinary and so wrong. Fingernails on steel, slow and persistent. We rolled past the crossing, and I saw the figures turning, following, stumbling along the ballast for a while until the train's speed outpaced them. They didn't stop because they got tired. They stopped because they lost the thing that had caught their attention. When we were clear and moving into open country again, we all sat in silence, breathing like we'd run miles. Marisol finally spoke. "They're learning." Denise shook her head. "We're the only moving thing they've seen in days. Of course they're learning." That night, in the dim light of our boxcar module, I drew a map on cardboard with a marker. It wasn't perfect, but it helped. I marked the spur where we had water. I marked the grain town. I marked a yard we'd passed earlier that looked quiet. I marked bridges and rivers we remembered. "We need rules," I said. "Rules for stops, rules for scouting, rules for emergencies." Denise leaned forward. "We already have rules." "We need more," I said. "We need a doctrine." Cal gave me a look like he didn't like the word, but he didn't argue. So we built our doctrine, and it became the foundation of the train fortress. We would only stop where we had 2 exits, a main line forward and a clear back-out option. We would never stop with our only escape route behind a blocked crossing. We would never stop within sight of dense urban areas. We would scout with 2 people minimum. We would use silent signals, hand signs, and keep radios low. We would never use the horn unless it was the only way to prevent a derailment or collision. We would run the locomotive on intervals, charge, idle, rest. We would maintain a fuel log like it was gold. And we would improve the train every time we stopped. Over the next weeks, our fortress became real. We added a second living space in another boxcar and connected them with a covered walkway made from tarps and rope so we could move between cars without being exposed. We built storage racks from scavenged shelving, and bolted them to the car walls. We set up a hand-washing station from a spigot and a gravity-fed jug because Marisol insisted on hygiene. And she was right. Illness would kill us as surely as in anything else. We found a rail maintenance pickup truck at one location, keys still inside, likely abandoned in a hurry. That changed our operations. The high rail gear allowed it to ride on rails, which meant we could scout ahead on track without risking the entire train. It also meant we could carry supplies farther. Cal and Denise knew how to operate it safely. I knew how to inspect it and keep it running. Marisol learned quickly. She wasn't a mechanic, but she was disciplined, and discipline is half of competence. The day we met the next survivors, it was because of the high rail truck. We were running a slow patrol ahead of the train, checking a long stretch of track for obstacles. In a curve near a wooded area, we saw smoke. Thin, controlled, like someone cooking, not like a wildfire. Denise slowed the high rail, and we listened. No screams, no running, just the crackle of a small fire. We rolled forward and saw them. 3 people near a makeshift camp beside the tracks. A man in a hoodie holding a hatchet, a woman with a backpack, and a teenager sitting on a log, eyes wide. They stood as we approached, fear in their posture. Cal raised a hand in a stop gesture, and we halted at a safe distance. The man called out, "Don't come closer." "We're not," Denise called back. "We're on rails. We can leave." The woman's voice shook. Are you safe?" "No guarantees," I said. "But we're surviving." The teenager stared at the high rail truck like it was a spaceship. Marisol spoke calmly. "What are your names?" The man hesitated. "Derek, that's Leanne, and that's my brother Nate." Nate didn't speak. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from too many nights without real sleep. Derek tightened his grip on the hatchet. "We're not sick. We've been on foot for days. We follow tracks because they're clear." I heard my own story in his words. Denise asked, "Any injuries?" Leanne lifted her sleeve to show a scrape. "Just this. Cleaned it." Marisol's gaze sharpened. "How? With what?" Leanne swallowed. "Water. Soap when we had it." Marisol nodded slowly like she was adding them to an internal chart. Cal looked at me. "We can't—" "I know," I said before he finished. "We couldn't take everyone. We couldn't become a rescue service. But we also couldn't ignore what this meant. The rails were becoming a migration route. If we didn't adapt, someone else would, and not everyone would be kind." I addressed Derek. "We live on a freight train. It moves. It's not comfortable, but it's safer than walking. If you come with us, you follow rules. Same as everyone." Derek's eyes narrowed. "Rules like what?" "No loud noise," Denise said. "No wandering off. No weapons drawn inside the cars. You contribute," Marisol added, "and you'll be observed before you're integrated. Separate space at first." Leanne's face tightened with relief and fear mixed together. "You have a doctor." "A paramedic," Marisol said, "and a mechanic, and railroad crew." Derek looked down at Nate, then back at us. His shoulders sagged like he'd been carrying a weight too long. "We'll do it." We brought them aboard, quarantined them in a different car, and watched. Nothing happened. No sudden illness, no strange behavior. Just people who were tired and hungry and grateful. Nate turned out to be the quiet miracle we didn't know we needed. He was 15, sharp-eyed, and used to thinking in systems because he'd been obsessed with model trains and electronics before the world ended. When he saw our improvised power setup, His eyes lit up for the first time. "You're using the locomotive like a generator," he said, almost excited. I blinked. "Yeah?" He pointed at a fuse block. "You should split the loads. If that blows, you lose everything." I stared at him, then at the block. He was right. From then on, Nate became my apprentice. Not because I wanted one, but because we needed redundancy. If I got hurt, the whole train could die. A fortress with one mechanic is a fragile fortress. Weeks became months. The world didn't return. The train became our moving town, and the rails became our map. We learned the hard reality of fuel. Locomotives carry a lot, but not infinite. We couldn't rely on fueling stations working. We began siphoning diesel from other locomotives and equipment where we could, using proper hoses and filters because contaminated fuel can ruin injectors and shut you down permanently. Every gallon became accounted for. Every idle hour became a choice. We learned the hard reality of winter. Metal cars become freezers. We scavenged insulation, sleeping bags, propane heaters, but we used them cautiously because enclosed spaces and fuel-burning heat can turn deadly if you don't ventilate properly. We cut small vents, used carbon monoxide alarms when we could find them, and relied more on layering than on burning fuel. We learned the hard reality of track hazards. Trees fell. Washouts happened after storms. Someone, whether survivors or simple chance, left debris on rails. We found a section where a switch had been thrown, diverting the line toward a dead-end industrial spur blocked by a collapsed gate. If Cal hadn't been moving slow, we would have shoved the lead cars into a jam and derailed. After that, we started sending the high rail ahead more often, and sometimes we walked sections on foot, spreading out, looking for changes. It was tedious, exhausting work, but it kept us alive. The fortress wasn't just metal, it was procedure. The moment the train fortress became truly tested was the day we encountered another train. We were moving on a main line through a rural stretch in Indiana when Denise spotted a shape ahead in the distance. At first, it looked like a shadow. Then it resolved into a locomotive, sitting dead on the track, nose toward us, like an animal blocking a narrow path. Cal eased down the throttle and brought us to a stop long before we reached it. "That's not right." Marisol peered through binoculars. "Do you see anyone?" "No movement," Denise said. I felt my pulse in my throat. A dead locomotive could mean a crew abandoned it. It could mean trouble. It could mean a trap. Derek, who had become our security-minded voice, said quietly, "Someone could be hiding inside." Or worse, I thought, someone could have tried to live inside and failed. We held position for a long time, watching. The other locomotive didn't move. No lights, no horn, nothing. Finally, we decided to scout with the high rail and on foot, cautiously. I went with Denise. Marisol stayed back with Cal, and Derek stayed near the train with his hatchet and a long metal bar we'd fashioned into something like a staff. It wasn't a weapon in the heroic sense. It was a tool that could become a weapon if it had to. As we approached the dead locomotive, the smell hit first. Stale diesel, old oil, and something else, sour and wrong. Denise whispered, "No." We stopped at a distance and listened. Nothing. The locomotive's cab door was partially open. Didn't want to go closer. Every instinct open. I didn't want to go closer. Every instinct screamed not to, but the track was blocked. We couldn't go forward. We had to make a choice, clear it, reverse, or get trapped. I held up a hand, signaling Denise to stay back, and I stepped forward slowly. Inside the cab, there were signs of a rushed exit. A lunch cooler tipped over, papers scattered, a handheld radio on the floor. No body, no gore, just absence and the stink of a place that had been closed too long. Denise stayed at the doorway, looking over my shoulder. Where did they go? I saw scratch marks on the inside of the cab door. Deep, frantic marks. My stomach turned. They didn't go, I said softly. They were taken. Denise swallowed hard. Then why is it here? I scanned the controls. The reverser was removed. Standard safety practice when leaving a locomotive unattended. Without the reverser handle, you can't easily power it. That meant the crew didn't just flee, they tried to secure it. But it was still blocking the main. We found the answer when we walked around the front. Someone had placed a crude barricade of rail ties on the track behind it, like they were trying to prevent another train from ramming it. A warning, not a trap. Then we saw the message, spray-painted on the side of the locomotive in shaky letters. Do not stop in towns. They wait at crossings. Marisol was right. They were learning. We returned to our train and relayed everything. Cal sat quietly for a long moment, hands on the controls, staring ahead at the dead locomotive like it was a tombstone. We can't move it without a reverser, he said. I nodded. We might be able to couple to it and drag it, but that's risky. Unknown brakes, unknown condition. Denise said. We can cut around it if there's a siding. I checked the track map we'd scavenged earlier, a paper employee timetable with sidings marked. There is, I said, a short siding half a mile back. Cal exhaled. Then we reverse. We reversed carefully, using radio coordination and slow speed. A freight train backing up is like steering a long rope. You don't force it, you guide it and pray the path stays clear. We reached the siding, lined the switch manually, and pulled in. It worked. We bypassed the dead locomotive and continued, leaving it behind like a warning sign. That night, in our living car, we talked about what the spray paint meant. It means other people are trying to survive, Leanne said, voice small. It also means towns are dangerous, Derek said. Crossings, funnel movement. Marisol nodded. Sound, lights, people, it all concentrates there. Nate leaned forward, surprising everyone. We should avoid crossings by stopping away from roads. If we have to stop, stop where there's no easy access. I looked at him. You're thinking like a railroader. He flushed slightly. I'm thinking like someone who doesn't want to die. That became another doctrine addition. No stops near crossings unless absolutely necessary. The fortress kept evolving. We built makeshift barriers on the exterior of certain cars, nothing that would interfere with clearance or derail us, but simple deterrence. Smooth metal panels on ladder rungs to make climbing harder, wire mesh over some handholds, noisemakers that would alert us if someone tried to board. We created zones inside the train. Sleeping, cooking, storage, medical. Marisol set up a medical corner with scavenged supplies and careful sanitation. We also began using railroad signals in a new way. With dispatch gone, signals could be dark or misleading, but the rails themselves gave information. Track condition, wheel sound, subtle vibrations. Cal taught me how he felt a train. I taught him how to read mechanical warnings before they became failures. I became obsessed with prevention. A failed traction motor blower could overheat a motor. A coolant leak could seize an engine. A clogged air filter could reduce performance. Every small thing mattered because there was no rescue. One afternoon, After a long run, I noticed a slight change in the locomotive's vibration. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of thing that only annoys you until it becomes catastrophic. I shut down the unit during our next stop and did a walk-around. I found a loose mounting bracket on an auxiliary component that had started to rattle. If it had failed fully, it could have damaged wiring and taken out a system. I tightened it and sat back on the ballast, suddenly shaking because I realized how thin the line was. The fortress wasn't invincible, it was just maintained. Denise sat beside me, watching the trees. "You okay?" I breathed out. "I keep thinking about one mistake." She nodded. "That's why you're good at this." I laughed once, a short sound. "That's why I'm terrified." She didn't argue. Fear keeps you careful. That was the second lesson. Fear is only useful if it becomes procedure. The third lesson came when we encountered people who weren't sick but weren't safe. It happened near a small yard outside St. Louis months later, after we'd moved south seeking better weather and different routes. The yard was quiet, trains dead on tracks like abandoned animals. We came in slow, using the high rail to check switches. Everything looked fine until a figure stepped out from behind a boxcar and waved. Not like someone needing help, like someone claiming territory. Then more figures appeared, spaced out, watching us. Derek stiffened. That's not good. Cal stopped the train and kept it in a position where we could reverse quickly. Denise lifted binoculars. They're armed. Armed with what looked like hunting rifles, maybe shotguns. I couldn't tell at distance, but the posture was clear. They were confident. A man in a heavy jacket walked toward us, hands visible but not empty. He carried a long firearm slung. He stopped far enough away to shout without yelling. "You can't come through here," he called. "This yard is controlled." Controlled, like a checkpoint. Cal didn't respond immediately. He looked at us. We weren't looking for conflict. Conflict was noise. Conflict was injury. Injury was death. Marisol whispered, "We should leave. Now." I agreed, but I also knew something else. A controlled yard could mean fuel, supplies, tools. It could also mean people who would take what we had. Denise called back, voice steady. "We're just passing." The man shook his head. "Passing costs." Derek muttered. "Knew it." Cal's hand hovered near the throttle. He didn't want to provoke, but he also didn't want to negotiate from a stopped train. I leaned forward and spoke loudly enough to carry. "We're not stopping. We're leaving." The man's face tightened. He lifted a hand and pointed, and two of his people moved toward a switch. My stomach dropped. If they threw a switch under us or blocked our route, we'd be trapped. "Back up," I told Cal immediately. "Now." Cal didn't hesitate. He eased the train into reverse, slow but steady, keeping slack controlled. The fortress began to roll backward, away from the yard throat. The man shouted something I didn't catch, and one of his people raised a weapon. There was a sharp crack, and something pinged against metal. A shot fired, not aimed to hit a person, but to send a message. The sound echoed across the yard, and in the distance I heard another sound that made my blood turn cold. The faint, collective shuffling of a gathering response. Noise had consequences. Cal backed us out faster. The train clanked and groaned, but it moved. We cleared the yard throat, and Denise lined a switch manually to get us onto a different route. We didn't look back. We didn't need to. The lesson was clear. Not every survivor is an ally, and the rails could be claimed by people who saw them as power. We ran hard that day, as hard as we dared, putting miles between us and the yard. By nightfall, we stopped in an empty rural siding and sat in silence, listening to the distant world. Marisol finally spoke. They'll start thinking like that everywhere. Control the rails, control movement. Derek nodded grimly. So we become harder to control. Nate looked up from the wiring he was reorganizing. We can make it harder to board. We can make it harder to stop us. I stared at the long steel body of the train stretching behind us into the dark. A fortress isn't just walls, it's mobility. It's the ability to choose your battles by choosing your ground. That night, I added the final line to our doctrine, written in marker on a piece of metal bolted to the inside of the living car like a plaque. The train moves. We live because we can leave. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't a metaphor. It was an instruction. Months later, the train fortress had a name, not because we wanted one, but because naming things makes them easier to talk about when the world is chaos. Nate started calling it the Iron Haven. Denise rolled her eyes at first, then used it herself when she thought nobody noticed. Cal didn't say it much, but he painted the letters small on a toolbox, like he was quietly accepting that this machine was now a home. Iron Haven became a moving community, small enough to manage, strong enough to survive. We learned to read smoke in the distance and decide whether it meant life or trouble. We learned to recognize the sound pattern of gatherings near crossings, an eerie, uneven rhythm like shoes dragging. We learned to use decoys, tossing a metal object away from the train to draw attention while we moved silently out. We learned to repair broken coupler hoses, to replace worn brake shoes when we could, to keep wheel bearings checked with infrared. And still, every day, we faced the same question. Where do you go when the world doesn't have a safe place anymore? The answer, for us, was always the same. We went where the rails went, but we did it with intention. We began seeking a long-term anchor point, a place where the train could rest without being trapped. It needed water. It needed a clear line in and out. It needed enough distance from dense population that we weren't constantly drawing attention. It needed physical features that could help us, a curve that hid the train, a cut where the track was below grade, a tree line that broke sight lines from roads. We found it in the Ozarks, on a seldom-used section of track near a maintenance area that had once served a quarry spur. The track ran through a shallow cut, rock walls on either side, trees above, and the nearest road crossing was far enough away that sound didn't carry easily. There was a small stream nearby, clean enough to filter. There were old service buildings half collapsed but still useful for storage. When we rolled into that cut for the first time, the train felt like it exhaled. The trees closed above us like a ceiling. The rock walls made us invisible from a distance. Denise whispered, "This is it." Cal nodded slowly. "This could work?" Marisol stepped down onto the ballast and looked around like she was measuring the place with her eyes. "We can build here." And we did. We didn't abandon the train. The train was the fortress. But we created a base around it. Quiet, simple, practical. We set up rain catchment from tarps. We built a small filtered water system using gravity and multiple stages. Cloth, pre-filter, charcoal. Then a proper purifier we scavenged from an outdoor store. We planted small gardens in raised containers scavenged from abandoned yards because fresh food matters more than people realize once the canned goods run low. We also built defenses that weren't about fighting. They were about warning and delay. Trip lines with small bells. visual markers on trees that told us if someone had passed. A strict no fire at night rule unless absolutely necessary, and even then, low and shielded. The train fortress became the center of a new kind of life, mobile when needed, anchored when possible. We ran supply missions along the rails in the high rail truck, bringing back what we could. We used the train as a shelter during storms, as a storage vault, as a power plant. We didn't become fearless. We became structured. The most important moment, the one that proved we'd built something real, came on an evening that should have been ordinary. I was in the locomotive compartment with Nate, doing a routine check of the battery charging system and the inverter loads. Denise was in the living car, organizing supplies. Cal was outside checking the track for debris after a storm. Marisol was on watch, binoculars scanning the tree line. Then the bell on one of our trip lines rang once. Soft, distant, unmistakable. Marisol's voice came through the radio, controlled but urgent. Movement on the south approach? Multiple. Cal's reply was immediate. On my way. Denise moved fast without panic. Everyone inside. Derek appeared in the doorway, face hard. How many? Marisol paused. Then, more than we've seen here before. I climbed into the cab and looked through the slit. At the far end of the cut, I saw them. A loose gathering drifting toward the rails, drawn by something. Maybe the smell of our gardens. Maybe a sound we didn't notice. Maybe simple wandering. They were not sprinting. They didn't need to sprint. They were persistent. Cal climbed up into the cab, breathing hard. We move? Denise hesitated. If we move, we lose the base. Marisol's voice stayed calm. If we stay, we test the fortress. I looked at Cal. In that second, I understood what the train had become. It wasn't just our escape plan. It was our wall. We stay, I said. Cal stared at me for a long beat, then nodded. Okay. We didn't blow the horn. We didn't make speeches. We did what we'd trained ourselves to do. We sealed the vulnerable access points. We took positions behind reinforced panels. We stayed quiet. We waited. The gathering reached to the near edge of the cut and began to drift along the rails, hands brushing rock, shoes scraping ballast. They noticed the train, of course, a long metal object in their world. Some pressed against the cars, palms smearing dirt on steel. Some wandered away and came back, pulled by the shape and the faint hum of the locomotive's systems. Then one of them found a ladder. A hand reached for a rung, slipped on a smooth panel we'd installed, and scraped down with a dry squeal. The noise wasn't loud, but it was enough to draw others. Derek's knuckles were white on his metal bar. They're trying. No? Marisol said softly, watching. They're testing. We stayed still. We let the barriers do their work. The smooth panels made climbing hard. The mesh made gripping awkward. The noisemakers clinked when hands moved where they shouldn't. One figure managed to hook a foot on a rung and pull up halfway. It pressed its face against the steel like it could smell us through it. It scratched once, twice, then slid back down. Minutes passed, then an hour. The gathering didn't break through. It didn't storm the train like a movie. It simply lingered, restless, then began to drift away as attention moved elsewhere. They didn't leave because we defeated them. They left because we didn't feed their attention. We didn't become a signal. When the last of them disappeared into the trees, the silence that followed felt heavy, like the world had been holding its breath. Denise finally sat down, hands shaking. We held. Cal nodded slowly. We held. Nate looked at me, eyes wide with something like pride. It worked. I leaned back against the cab wall and let myself breathe. My heart was pounding like I'd been running, but I hadn't moved. That was the new kind of survival. Endurance without drama. That night, we didn't celebrate. We didn't make it into a victory story. We did maintenance. We checked panels. We tightened bolts. We reinforced one ladder where the barrier had flexed. Nate improved the fuse layout. Marisol inspected everyone's hands for small cuts because even minor injuries mattered. Denise updated the supply log. Cal walked the track again, listening. Because the fortress wasn't one big moment. It was 1,000 small decisions done correctly. I still think about the first night, when I climbed into a locomotive cab because roads felt like traps and rails felt like a path. I didn't know then that the train would become my house, my job, my community, my line between life and a world that didn't behave anymore. Now, when the wind moves through the trees above the cut and the train sits quiet in its stone cradle, I sometimes feel something close to peace. Not happiness, not comfort, just the steady knowledge that we built a system that works. The rails are still there, the steel still runs forward, and as long as the Iron Haven can move, as long as we can maintain it, as long as we can choose when to leave, we can keep surviving. Tomorrow we'll run the high rail west to check the next bridge and look for fuel caches near an old service area we marked on the map. We'll do it the same way we do everything. Slow, controlled, quiet. We'll come back before dark. We'll log every gallon, every bolt, every battery. We'll eat our measured meals. We'll sleep in shifts. We'll keep our hands clean and our minds sharper than our fear. Because out here, on the rails, survival isn't about being the strongest. It's about being the most consistent. And this train, this long steel-backed moving fortress, is consistency made real.